Jeffrey Gundlach is the CEO and co-founder of DoubleLine. He joins us today.
The bond king himself, Jeffrey Gundlach.
Certainly the word that gets tossed around is unprecedented, and you were just referencing your 35 plus years in the market's never seen anything quite like this.
The mainstream media is now in cahoots with the Fed governors, really almost cheerleading for higher inflation and telling you don't worry about it. But inflation is obviously heading higher.
It's a critically important moment in the history of global economics and markets. Unprecedented amounts of central bank money printing, government interventions, and still, grappling with issues of debt, income inequality.
One weird thing about the deficit is it really isn't inflationary until you start actually declaring the liabilities of the Federal Reserve to be legal tender and actually giving money to people, which we're starting to do. That's why I'm ultimately an inflationist. When the next big meltdown happens, I think the US is going to be the worst performing market, actually. And they'll have a lot to do with the dollar weakening. The opportunities that are really good are very rare. And I want to have liquidity when the next one comes. I did a thought experiment last fall that I think is very interesting. And that is, what happens if interest rates actually stay where they are or even go higher? What happens when we have all this debt coming due and we're running a 6.5% budget deficit as a percent of GDP, and the economy, to my eyes, appears to be weakening? A lot of early indicators have flipped towards recession. And the last one that goes always is the actual unemployment rate, which on a state level is rising. Also, we have hours worked, as you referenced, are going down. First, they cut the hours, then they cut the bodies. That's how it works in the business cycle. And you also have temporary employment. A lot of the continuing claims are rising. That's a sign as well. The quit rate is falling. It's actually now where it was pre-pandemic. So what happens if we go into recession? Well, historically, what's happened, if you look at back 60 years, on average, the deficit goes up about 4 percentage points during recession. Now, that isn't the case in the last 3 recessions. In fact, in the last 3 recessions, the deficit went up by 9% of GDP on average. So let's just say that it might go up from 6.5 today to, 8% or 12%, depending upon how optimistic or pessimistic you want to be. It's going to be higher in a recession. Well, if interest rates stay where they are today, or let's just say they go to 6%. Some people think rates can still go higher. Let's just say they go to 6 as a thought experiment, and the deficit is 8% of GDP. Well, if it stays there for 5 years, I hope everybody is ready for this. 5 years from now, using today's tax system, if we didn't change the tax system, 50% of tax receipts would have to go to interest expense. 50%, which is completely possible. That would be in the context of the last 3 recessions. And let's say, just to be really draconian about it, that all of that debt makes interest rates go higher still. So let's just say we go back to the 1980s, 1990s types of interest rates, and say we get 9% interest rates. Well, I've got news for you. 100% of tax receipts in today's tax system would go to interest expense, which I think we can all agree is not possible. That can't be done. So we're in this scheme where we're giving out money seems to be the answer to everything. Now, I think there was a $78 billion bill that's being discussed or passed or executive order or whatever it is in the past week, which is giving money to people again. So we're back to that system. And I think that that's what we're going to be doing. And one of the things that I think is very important that is almost a curse for somebody like me that's been at this game for over 40 years. And that is, we think we know things. We think we know economic relationships. We think we know how markets interact. But maybe that's all informed by the fact that over that 40-year period, broadly speaking, interest rates just fell. And so when you had problems, people were able to refinance at lower interest rates, like the junk bond market. The junk bond market started really in the early 80s, about a little over 40 years ago. And over that time period, we had recessions, of course, on multiple occasions. But junk bonds didn't really have to default because interest rates go down during recessions, and they were able to refinance at ever lower interest rates. There's a famous saying by Mark Twain It isn't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you think you know that just ain't so.
Yeah.
And maybe a lot of our ideas are informed only by falling interest rates, and now they're not falling anymore. They've bottomed out, and now they're rising. What if we actually have, I don't know, defaults in the next recession, but interest rates don't allow for refinancing? Maybe the default rate will be much higher. Maybe the recovery rate will be much lower. So all these things I think are really interesting because now we are experiencing the consequences of a foolishly long period of zero interest rates, which allowed us to borrow all this money, and now it's being refinanced. It's going to have to be refinanced at what is today much higher interest rate levels. And this is going to be a problem that we absolutely have to deal with. The trustees of the Medicaid system acknowledge that they're going to be out of money using the CBO's projections by 2030. And the Social Security Administration's trustees acknowledge that they'll be out of money in 2032. So that assumes, though, by the CBO, it assumes some pretty optimistic scenarios. They assume that interest rates will be at 3%. Well, they're at 4 to 5 already. So that's an optimistic assumption. They assume that the budget deficit will be about 3 or 4%. Well, it's 6.5% now. So, and they assume, of course, no recession ever, which I can't fault them for, because who knows how they would try to predict when and how steep and severe recessions would be. So they assume that GDP growth will be about 4% on a nominal basis, about 2% on a real basis forever. Well, that's not going to happen. So there's almost assuredly going to be a recession by the time we get to 2028. I think there's going to be one before we get to 2025. But what that means is that the assumption of no money for Medicaid in 2030 and no money for Social Security in 2032 is too optimistic. So you have to bring it forward. So that means I'm just going to pick a random number and say maybe they run out of money in 2027 or 2028. Well, that's going to be a really big moment, because here we are in 2024, we have a presidential election, and people are worried about the deficit. I definitely feel like there's getting more talk about this problem, and it's getting more serious consideration, but it's not going to be a factor in the 2024 election. But I think in the 2028 election, there'll be nothing else. How are we going to deal with this? Because we've got in this country, per the Debt Clock website, debtclock.org, we have $212 trillion of unfunded liabilities. Do you know what the total assets are in the United States? 190 trillion. So we're what you call bankrupt. If we were a hedge fund, we'd be praying every night that we don't get a margin call, because our liabilities exceed our assets, and we have to restructure them. And we're going to have to do that. And it will actually be a cathartic event, I think, when we do it. And it will lead to a period of potential prosperity. But between here and there lies the valley. When Janet Yellen left, we were at zero for a long time, and she did it like a token type of hike. She hiked once and then retired. I have a feeling that Jay Powell may cut once. I think he definitely wants to leave with inflation starting with a 2. We're going to get there on our base case if we assume that the energy complex doesn't blow up with some sort of problem in the Mideast. If oil stays somewhere around $70, $75 on West Texas Intermediate, I think we're going to go down to about 2.5%. And I think that'll allow Jay Powell to cut rates once. I think he doesn't want to cut it a lot, because he does have a legacy now that's looking like he was able to get inflation down. But I do think that the response to the recession that I believe is coming this year, but certainly will come in the next 18 months or 2 years or something like that, I think the response is going to be really extreme. We've had this pattern of what we've been doing is cutting rates to zero in economic hardship and giving people money and doing quantitative easing. And that's kind of the playbook. So I think when the next recession comes, the deficit will be so bad that something really radical will happen. And I think I think they might cut interest rates on the short end radically, but I think that the dollar will really, really suffer under the size of that deficit. And so I'm of the opinion, this goes back to my 40 years, and I agree with Howard Marks, that's over. I think that the response will be so inflationary to the next recession, because all we can do is print money and give it to people. That's our playbook. I think actually yields will fall initially, and that's sort of happening now. That's kind of why I think recession is closer than most people think, because we had a peak in interest rates of over 5%, and now most interest rates are down at about 4%. So, I mean, rates have fallen. They might fall even further if we really get negative signs on the economy. But I think what will surprise everybody is the response will be such that bond yields will actually start to go up. And they might go up a lot. And we could have a very high long-term interest rate with a manipulated short-term interest rate of the Fed's choosing. But that, to me, means that the whole system kind of has to reset. We're finally getting to that point of the fourth turning. And I think Neil Howe's book is The Fourth Turning is Here, is his most recent book. And he completely is on the same wavelength as I am. And that is that this all has to be fixed. And fixed doesn't mean we go back and pretend that it's like 1965 again, which is what all these octogenarian politicians seem to act like. They act like we have endless amounts of money. They act like we're the strongest we've ever been, that we dominate the world. And it's just not true. And so we can't go back. We have to go forward. And I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's going to be restructuring all these liabilities. We're probably going to have to kind of readjust the currency to have some backing to it, some discipline, some sort of guiding mechanisms. And this is a very interesting time, because I used to talk about this 20 years ago and say, don't worry about it, it's 25 years away. But now it's 20 years later. And so it's only a few years away. And this is going to be quite the wild ride. So I don't know, we might have to kind of rethink the Federal Reserve. We might have to kind of cancel a lot of the institutions that we've been using and come up with better ones that people can believe in, ones that people can say, I buy into this system. I think that we have now a decent property relations, and we can get them in sync with the means of production and get it so that we don't have such a wildly disparate outcome for 0.01% of the population versus 98% of the population. It's a strange system, and it needs to be restructured. I think tax code needs to be restructured. I think the Federal Reserve needs to be restructured. I think the way we manage our debt needs to be restructured. And that is that's a heavy lift, but we're up to it. We're going to do it. I've been predicting for, 10, 12 years now, that we're going to see an election that gets decided in the House of Representatives, because there's going to be a non-majority. I mean, the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won, but he only had 40% of the vote. Fortunately for him, it was in the Electoral College states, and it carried him with only 40% of the popular vote. Of course, that led to a civil war. 7 states seceded from the Union before Lincoln was even sworn into office. So I think something like that is all part of this mix. It sounds a little bit dire and dark, but actually it's not. It's exciting and optimistic. It's sort of like when you have a problem, once you say, I'm going to solve this problem, there's an excitement behind it. You dread it at first, and there's an excitement. Like when people decide, I'm going to get out of debt. I'm going to stop borrowing money. I'm going to tear up my credit cards. I'm going to get a side hustle. I'm going to take a second job. And it sounds like a huge burden, but it's invigorating at the same time. And because you have a goal at the end, a goal that you believe in, and it is worth believing. That's why young people are so mad. They're getting mad at all the baby boomers, because the baby boomers get like 8 times as much government spending as do people that are 35 and under, which is a crazy way to run a society. You don't want to invest money in people that have no stake in the future. You want to invest money in people that own the future, that create the future, that are the future. I think it's just amazing that we have all of these octogenarian politicians that just keep winning. Why do people keep voting for this? You know, it seems that people don't even understand that in California, you can steal $950 from a store and you won't get prosecuted. And you know who voted for that? Californians, people in California who are presently, moaning and groaning about how much crime there is. Well, you voted for it. Why do we keep voting for this stuff? And I think we're not going to. It seems highly unlikely that we could stay the reserve currency, and we're already seeing it kind of fraying around the edges. We see China buying energy from Russia, using rubles. There's transactions that are happening now that are skirting the dollar, and they certainly want to supplant the dollar, at least have a seat at the table of the reserve currency. And this is why I think the next recession is the problem for the reserve currency status of the dollar, because it's going to be a very, very bad economic situation, fiscal situation, and that goes along with accelerating the trend towards another reserve currency. Yeah, I do think that there's a desire for control among the so-called global elites. I think that's become relatively apparent in recent years, and I certainly think that digital currency is something that they would be viewed valuable by people that want to, pull the levers of power, because what you end up doing is tracking everything you do,
right?
Which it feels like they're doing already via social media and listening to your conversations through your coffee pot maker, and all that stuff, these appliances, your micro. But once you get the digital currency, I find it very strange that people talk about how attractive, like Bitcoin, we'll just use that as a digital currency, how Bitcoin is and how excited they became when there were ETFs that could do Bitcoin, because it seems very contradictory to me. If your appeal was this transparency or anonymity with Bitcoin, then why would you want to buy it on a regulated exchange? It seems utterly counterproductive. I for one, don't believe that that Bitcoin is anonymous. I don't believe that you can hide underneath it. I noticed that prosecutors have successfully prosecuted criminals because they use Bitcoin. The opposite of transparency. Your record is there for till the end of eternity. So that, I think, is. I had an ant problem where I had in my closet, I had this incredible amount of ants, and a fellow told me, hey, there's this recipe, you can look it up online on how to get rid of ants. And what you do is you take water and you put sugar in it, and then you add borax, the 20 mule train borax, and you soak it a cotton ball in it, and you just put it in where the ant line is. And I would recommend that you put it on a piece of tin foil, because the solution ends up sticking. You put it, it's hard to get rid of it. So I put it in the closet, and I couldn't believe what happened, because I looked at it about 6 hours later, and it was like a horror movie. I couldn't believe how many ants there were. You think you got a lot of ants, you can't believe how many there are. Like a blur of ants, and they were going from the cotton ball. They take the solution and they would put it into the nest, and within 2 days there were no ants anymore. It killed the entire ant colony, because what happens is the ants love the sugar water, but they don't have an awareness that they're also carrying the borax, which happens to be toxic and poisonous and ends up killing them. I kind of feel that that's what Bitcoin is. They act like the anonymity is the sugar water, but it's actually the borax, which is the blockchain record lasts forever. A lot of times these things are the opposite of what they're sold as, and it's very disappointing. I hate seeing people disappointed. I hate it when people sell somebody a bill of goods and it turns out that they're just swindling them. It really makes me very angry. So I think Bitcoin might be that, but like it or not, it does seem like that would be consistent. Some movement towards that type of a system is certainly consistent with things that I'm talking about. Yeah, I have a really hard time believing that a third party is going to win this go round. I just think it's too late. It just takes so much time to organize and get on the ballots. I know the No Labels group is talking about that they're on some fraction that's not insignificant of state ballots, but that's not going to work. You need to be in every state. You need organization and all that. I think that's more of a 2028 issue. I sure hope that a third party. I hope No Labels actually gets on ballots and sustains. I'd like to see RFK Jr. In the race. I mean, I don't agree with everything he says, but I agree with a significant enough fraction that if he were running, I would vote for him over Republican or Democrat. I would. And I used to think that he had no hope of winning because he's so difficult to listen to, because he's got that neurological problem. I've actually completely changed my mind on that. I actually think it's like his superpower, because he comes from this dynasty of a family of privilege and all of that. It makes him more human. It makes him more relatable. It's a vulnerability to a certain extent, and I don't really mind listening to him. I've gotten used to it, and it doesn't bother me at all. But you know, it is an acquired taste, I guess. But I do think I would definitely vote for him. If I particularly like his original thinking, and I'm really tired of forever wars.